Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into a world that smells like wet straw, wood smoke, and something you probably don't want to identify too closely. You blink your eyes open and discover that the soft mattress you're used to is gone. Instead, you're lying on a sack stuffed with lumpy straw. Somewhere nearby, a rooster screams like it's personally offended by the sunrise. Cold air sneaks through the cracks of a wooden wall and nips at your nose. Congratulations, you've just woken up in medieval Europe. And, just between us, you probably won't survive this. You stretch your legs, which immediately protest because the straw mattress has managed to poke every uncomfortable spot in your body. Outside, the faint, grey light of early morning seeps through a tiny window hole that's covered with something that might be cloth, or might just be wishful thinking. The village around you is already waking up. A goat bleats somewhere outside. A baby cries. Wooden carts creak as someone drags them over uneven ground. The entire place smells like damp earth and smoke from last night's cooking fire. You sit up slowly, realizing something important right away. Medieval mornings are not gentle. There's no alarm clock with a soft melody, no warm shower waiting, and definitely no coffee machine humming in the corner. Instead, the day begins with cold air, aching muscles, and the quiet realization that everything here requires effort. Historically speaking, most people in medieval Europe lived in tiny villages like this one. In fact, historians estimate that around 85 to 90% of the population were peasants, working the land just to survive. Cities existed, of course, but most ordinary people spent their entire lives in rural communities that barely changed for generations. You push yourself to your feet, ducking slightly because the ceiling beams are low. The floor beneath you is packed dirt. It's hard and uneven, and if you look closely, you might notice little pieces of straw scattered across it. That's not decoration. That's the floor. You shuffle toward the door and step outside into the early morning chill. Mist clings to the fields surrounding the village, and the rising sun turns everything pale gold. For a moment, it actually looks peaceful. But then the smells hit. Wood smoke, animal dung, wet soil, and something sour that probably involved last week's food scraps. Medieval villages were busy places, but sanitation was, let's call it, a work in progress. In fact, most homes shared space with animals. Chickens wandered freely, pigs rooted around near the edges of the street. A cow might even sleep inside a family's house during winter because animals produced warmth. You glance down the dirt path that serves as the village road. It's muddy, uneven, and dotted with puddles that you absolutely should not step in if you value your sense of smell. A woman carrying a wooden bucket walks past you, heading toward a nearby well. She doesn't seem surprised to see you, which is impressive considering you're probably dressed like someone who wandered in from the future. Water, by the way, is going to become very important today, because medieval life revolves around it. People needed water for cooking, washing, animals, brewing ale, and sometimes even putting out the occasional accidental fire. But clean water was never guaranteed. Wells could become contaminated, and rivers carried everything from laundry soap to animal waste. And yes, historians still argue whether medieval people truly drank ale more often than water. Some scholars believe weak ale, sometimes called small beer, was safer to drink because the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. Others argue that clean wells were actually common in smaller villages. Either way, you're probably not getting a refreshing bottle of chilled water anytime soon. As you stand there, trying to figure out what medieval morning etiquette is, a man trudges past carrying a wooden hoe over his shoulder. He looks exhausted, and the day hasn't even started yet. This is where the reality of medieval survival begins to sink in. Life here is built around constant labor. Crops must be planted, animals fed, fences repaired, firewood gathered, and tools maintained. There are no weekends. There is no retirement plan. There is just work, and more work, and then work again tomorrow. You notice the fields stretching beyond the village. Long strips of farmland divide the landscape into narrow rectangles. This system is called strip farming, part of the open field agricultural system used throughout medieval Europe. Instead of owning one neat square field, peasants often worked several thin strips scattered across larger communal fields. It sounds inefficient, and honestly, it kind of was, but it helped spread risk if one part of the land failed. Now here's a strange little historical detail. Sometimes villagers believed crops could be protected by rituals. In certain places, farmers would walk around their fields chanting blessings or carrying church relics to keep away pests and bad weather. Did it work? Well, historians still debate how much people truly believed in these practices versus simply following tradition. But when your survival depends on the harvest, you're willing to try almost anything. A dog trots past you, sniffing the ground with great seriousness. Somewhere behind you, a wooden door slams and someone starts chopping wood. The village is fully awake now. You take a deep breath, which is maybe a mistake, considering the smell of pigs nearby. And that's when another realization hits you. You're hungry. Unfortunately, medieval breakfast is not exactly a feast. There are no pancakes, no cereal boxes, no refrigerators full of options. Food here is simple and often repetitive. For most peasants, the morning meal might be nothing more than a piece of coarse bread and maybe a bit of leftover porridge. Meat? Rare. Fruit? Seasonal. Spices? Practically non-existent for ordinary villagers. Bread, however, is everywhere. Medieval bread could be made from wheat if you were lucky, or barley, rye, or oats if you weren't. Some loaves were dark, dense, and heavy enough that modern bakers might politely call them rustic. Others were so coarse that tiny pieces of grit from the grinding stones sometimes ended up in the flour, which means, fun fact, medieval people often had worn down teeth by adulthood. Grinding stones occasionally shed tiny fragments into flour, and chewing that gritty bread every day slowly eroded enamel. Delicious, right? The rooster crows again somewhere nearby, louder this time, as if reminding the entire village that the day isn't waiting for anyone. You look across the fields once more. Mist is lifting. Farmers are already walking toward the land they'll spend the next 12 hours working. And standing here, still adjusting to the smell, the cold, and the very real possibility that your next meal might involve barley porridge, you begin to understand something important. Surviving a single day in medieval Europe is not about adventure or heroic battles. It's about endurance. It's about waking up cold, working hard, eating little, and hoping tomorrow isn't worse. And honestly, the day has barely started. You take a few careful steps along the muddy village path, trying not to slip. The ground here is soft from last night's rain, and every footstep makes a quiet squelching sound. Medieval villages rarely had proper roads. Most were simply worn tracks carved by years of carts, animals, and muddy boots. A cart rolls past you slowly, pulled by an ox that looks patient, but deeply unimpressed with life. The wooden wheels creak loudly as they turn. The driver barely glances at you before continuing down the path toward the fields. You follow the direction everyone else seems to be going. Out there, beyond the cluster of huts, the real work of medieval survival begins. The fields stretch across the countryside in long, narrow strips. At first glance, it looks chaotic, like someone sliced the land into ribbons and handed them out randomly. But there's actually a system here. Medieval farming was often organized under what historians call the manorial system. A manore was essentially a self-contained agricultural estate controlled by a local lord. Peasants worked the land, and in return they were allowed to live on small plots and grow food for themselves. But the arrangement came with obligations, lots of them. Several days each week, peasants had to work directly on the lord's fields instead of their own. This unpaid labor was called corvée, and it was simply part of life. If the lord needed crops planted, fences fixed, or hay gathered, the villagers showed up. Not because they wanted to, because the system required it. You step into one of the fields and immediately notice something surprising. No tractors, no engines, no metal machines humming along in neat rows. Instead, the tools are simple and stubbornly manual. Wooden plows pulled by oxen drag through the soil, leaving rough lines behind them. Farmers bend over with hoes, turning dirt by hand. This kind of work is exhausting even for people who've done it their entire lives. For you, it's going to be brutal. You try to imagine working here from sunrise to sunset, day after day, season after season. Medieval farmers didn't just plant crops, they wrestled with the land constantly. Soil had to be loosened, weeds pulled, stones removed, and if the weather turned bad, months of work could vanish in a single storm. Historians still argue whether medieval farming was as inefficient as it appears today. Some scholars believe peasants were surprisingly skilled at managing their land using crop rotation and local knowledge. One common system was the three-field rotation method. One field planted with winter crops like wheat, one field planted with spring crops like oats or barley, and one field left empty fallow so the soil could recover. This system actually increased food production compared to older methods. It wasn't perfect, but it helped villagers survive in a world where every harvest mattered. Nearby, a farmer guides an ox forward while pushing a plough. The animal moves slowly, its hooves pressing deep into the wet earth. You notice something else too. Everyone looks tired, not dramatically tired, not collapsing tired, just quietly, constantly tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of labor. Most peasants woke before sunrise and worked until dusk. In summer, that could mean 14 or 15 hours of physical effort. And the reward? Enough food to make it through the winter, hopefully. But even with careful planning, medieval agriculture lived dangerously close to disaster. A bad harvest could push an entire village towards starvation. This wasn't rare, it happened often. For example, historians frequently mention the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rain destroyed crops across northern Europe. Fields flooded, grain rotted, and livestock died. Millions of people suffered from hunger during those years. You look around at the quiet fields and try to imagine that happening here. The mist, the mud, the simple tools. It suddenly feels fragile. Another farmer walks past carrying a sack of seeds. He scatters them by hand across the soil with a steady motion, step after step. Planting by hand required patience and faith, because once those seeds disappeared into the ground, there was nothing to do but wait and hope. Now here's a strange little detail about medieval farming. In some regions, farmers believed that planting crops during certain phases of the moon improved the harvest. The idea was that the moon influenced moisture in the soil, just like it influenced ocean tides. Modern science doesn't really support that theory, but medieval villagers followed traditions like this for generations. When your life depends on the harvest, superstition becomes part of the routine. A breeze moves across the fields, carrying the smell of damp earth and animals. Somewhere nearby, a crow calls out from a fence post. You watch a group of farmers working together to lift a heavy wooden beam into place. Cooperation was essential here. Villagers often shared tools, animals, and labor, because no single person could manage everything alone. Medieval life was intensely communal. Your neighbors were your co-workers, your emergency support system, and sometimes your only safety net. Of course, that closeness also meant privacy barely existed. Everyone knew everyone's business. If someone skipped work in the field, the entire village would notice. If someone stored extra grain secretly, rumors would spread. And speaking of grain, bread was the backbone of medieval survival. Grain harvested in autumn had to last all year. Wheat was ideal, but many peasants relied on rye, barley, or oats. These grains were ground into flour using large millstones, often located at a mill owned by the local lord, which meant villagers sometimes had to pay a fee just to grind their own grain. Historians still debate how strictly these mill fees were enforced, but the system clearly favored the lord. Control the mill, control the bread supply. A clever arrangement if you were the one collecting the payments. You crouch down and scoop a little soil in your hand. It's cool and damp, dark with nutrients. Good farmland was incredibly valuable in medieval Europe, which is why wars were often fought over fertile land. And here you are, standing in the middle of it, trying to imagine surviving even a single day. A shout echoes across the field as someone calls to another worker. The ox pulling the plough stops for a moment while its handler wipes sweat from his forehead. The sun is climbing higher now, burning away the last of the morning mist. The day's work has truly begun, and you're starting to realize something that medieval peasants already understood very well. Food doesn't come from a grocery store. It comes from long hours in the dirt, uncertain weather, and the quiet hope that nothing goes terribly wrong before harvest. Because if it does, the consequences are very real, and the day, somehow, is still just getting started. The short break ends almost as quietly as it began. No bell rings, no manager calls everyone back. The villagers simply stand up, stretch their backs, and return to work as if the fields themselves are gently pulling them back. You follow along. The soil feels warmer now under the rising sun, and the air carries that earthy smell of fresh dirt and crushed plants. It's peaceful in a strange way, until you remember that this quiet landscape hides an enormous amount of exhausting labor. A farmer gestures for you to help move bundles of cut barley toward a wooden cart. You bend down and lift one. It's heavier than it looks. Each bundle is tightly tied with straw, and the stalks scratch your arms as you carry it across the field. You place it onto the cart beside a growing pile that will eventually be hauled back toward the village. In medieval farming, almost everything happened by hand. Harvesting grain alone required several steps. Cutting the stalks with a sickle, bundling them together, transporting them to a threshing area, and then separating the edible grain from the husks. That last part, called threshing, was often done by beating the bundles against wooden boards or using flails. It was slow, repetitive work, and if you're imagining large farming machines doing it faster, well, those wouldn't appear for several hundred years. You carry another bundle, and another. Soon your arms feel like they're made of stone. A woman nearby works faster than anyone else in the field, tying bundles with practiced efficiency. She's probably done this since childhood. In fact, that's another important detail about medieval life. Children began working very young, by the age of 7 or 8. Many children were already helping with chores, tending animals, or assisting in the fields. Education existed, of course, but formal schooling was mostly limited to wealthier families or those connected to the church. For most villagers, learning meant watching adults and copying what they did. Skills passed from generation to generation, like quiet traditions. You pause for a moment and watch the oxen again as they pull a cart slowly across the dirt path. The wooden wheels creak loudly with every turn. Those wheels are solid wood, by the way, not the rubber tires you're used to. Travel in medieval Europe could be extremely slow and uncomfortable. Roads were often little more than muddy tracks, and after heavy rain, they sometimes became nearly impossible to use. Historians often debate just how connected medieval villages were to the outside world. Some scholars argue that many rural communities were surprisingly isolated, with people rarely traveling more than a few miles from their birthplace. Others point out that trade routes, markets, and pilgrimages created more movement than we might expect. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, but one thing is certain. Most villagers lived their entire lives within a very small geographic circle. You stretch your back again and look toward the distant hills. Imagine living your entire life within sight of those hills. Never boarding an airplane, never driving a car, never even seeing a city larger than a local market town. For many medieval peasants, that was simply normal. Suddenly, a rooster crows loudly somewhere near the village. You blink. Roosters crowing during the day feels strange if you're used to them being morning alarms, but they actually crow whenever they feel like announcing their presence. And in medieval villages, animals were everywhere. Pigs wandered freely through streets, chickens scratched around houses, and goats sometimes climbed onto things they definitely shouldn't. In fact, there's a rather quirky historical tidbit about medieval pigs. In some cities during the Middle Ages, pigs roaming the streets became such a problem that laws were passed to control them. One famous story from Paris describes a prince being thrown from his horse after it tripped over a pig running loose in the street. After that incident, stricter rules about pig ownership were introduced. So yes, pigs once caused royal traffic accidents. You chuckle quietly to yourself while stacking another bundle of barley, but the humour fades when you notice the dark clouds creeping closer in the sky. Weather again. Farmers glance upward with growing concern. Rain during harvest season could be disastrous. Wet grain might rot before it could be stored properly, ruining months of hard work. One older farmer mutters something about praying for clear skies. Religion, of course, played an enormous role in medieval life. Church bells structured the day, holy festivals marked the calendar, and many people believed natural events, good or bad, reflected divine influence. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers truly interpreted every storm or drought as a religious message. But it's clear that faith offered something very important: explanation. When the world felt unpredictable, belief provided a sense of order. You lift another bundle onto the cart and feel sweat running down your neck. Your back aches. Your hands sting, and the sun hasn't even reached its highest point yet. This is when you begin to realize something surprising. The hardest part of medieval life isn't just the labor itself, it's the endless repetition. Tomorrow will look very similar to today, and the day after that, planting, harvesting, repairing tools, tending animals, gathering firewood, baking bread, again and again and again and again. Yet somehow, the villagers around you continue moving with steady patience. They talk quietly, share small jokes, and occasionally pause to stretch before returning to their tasks. There's a rhythm to it, a rhythm built from centuries of tradition. You glance toward the village again and notice smoke rising from several chimneys. Someone is probably preparing the evening meal already. That thought alone feels comforting, because if medieval life has taught you anything so far, it's this. After a day like this, dinner is going to feel very well earned. The fire burns lower now, its orange glow painting slow-moving shadows across the wooden walls. Dinner is finished, bowls are stacked aside, and the village settles into the quiet rhythm of evening. There's no electricity, of course. No glowing screens, no buzzing notifications pulling attention every few seconds. Just the soft crackle of the hearth and the occasional murmur of conversation. You lean back slightly, letting your tired legs stretch out. After a full day of labor, even sitting still feels like a luxury. A few villagers continue talking quietly near the fire. One of them begins repairing a wooden tool handle with careful, practiced movements. Another woman spins wool using a simple spindle, the thread forming slowly between her fingers. Even after sunset, small tasks continue. Medieval life wastes very little time, but the atmosphere is slower now, gentler. Outside, darkness settles over the village like a heavy blanket. Without streetlights or modern illumination, medieval nights were incredibly dark. The only real sources of light were candles, oil lamps, and the stars overhead. And the stars, when you step outside for a moment, are astonishing. Without modern light pollution, the medieval night sky would have looked far brighter than what most people see today. The Milky Way stretches clearly across the sky like a glowing river. For medieval villagers, the sky wasn't just beautiful, it was meaningful. Many believed celestial movements carried spiritual or mystical significance. Astrologers studied the stars carefully, trying to predict events on Earth. Kings sometimes consulted astrologers before major decisions. Historians still argue whether medieval rulers genuinely believed in astrology or simply used it to reinforce authority and mystique. Either way, the stars held power in people's imaginations. You return inside the house, rubbing your hands together against the cool night air. The fire welcomes you back with soft warmth. Near the hearth, someone begins humming a slow tune. It's simple, almost hypnotic. Medieval music often relied on repeating melodies rather than complex compositions. No orchestras, no recorded music, just human voices and simple instruments like flutes, lutes, or small drums. Tonight, too, the humming is enough. Your eyelids grow a little heavier, but before sleep comes another quiet activity common in medieval evening storytelling. An older villager clears his throat and begins recounting a tale about a traveler who once crossed dangerous forests to reach a distant monastery. According to the story, the traveler encountered wolves, bandits, and a mysterious hermit who claimed to speak with angels. Is it true? Probably not, but that's not really the point. Stories served many purposes in medieval villages. They entertained, preserved traditions, and sometimes passed along lessons about bravery, caution, or faith. And without books available to most people, since manuscripts were expensive and literacy rates were low, oral storytelling was the main way knowledge traveled. You listen quietly as the tale unfolds. Interestingly, one mainstream historical fact about medieval literacy often surprises modern audiences. Most peasants could not read or write. Literacy was primarily limited to clergy, monks, and certain nobles. Monasteries became centers of learning where monks carefully copied manuscripts by hand. Each book could take months or even years to complete, which makes modern libraries and e-books seem almost miraculous by comparison. The story continues. The traveler, according to the tale, eventually reaches the monastery after days of wandering. The monks welcome him with bread, ale, and a warm fire, simple comforts that feel almost sacred after hardship. Someone near you chuckles softly at that part, because honestly, after today's work in the field, bread and a fire already feel sacred. As the story winds down, the conversation shifts again. A few villagers begin discussing the coming harvest. Weather matters enormously here. Too much rain can ruin crops. Too little rain can cause famine. In fact, historians know that medieval Europe occasionally experienced devastating food shortages. One of the most famous was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when heavy rains destroyed harvests across large parts of the continent. Millions suffered during those difficult years. Thankfully, tonight's village seems safe for now. The granaries still hold grain. The animals appear healthy. And tomorrow's work will continue like always. Another quirky medieval tidbit appears during the conversation. Someone mentions placing a small charm near the grain storage to keep pests away. These charms sometimes included tiny carved symbols or bits of bone tied together with thread. Now, modern science might not approve of magical pest control, but interestingly, certain charms included herbs like mint or lavender, which actually do repel insects. Once again, medieval superstitions sometimes overlapped with accidental practicality. The fire burns lower still. A candle is lit, casting a smaller, steadier glow across the room. Candles were valuable items in medieval households, often made from animal fat called tallow. They worked well enough, though they also produced a slightly smoky smell. You suppress a small yawn. Your body feels heavy now, the kind of deep fatigue that only comes after real physical work, not the tiredness of staring at screens, but the honest exhaustion of muscles that have spent the day lifting, digging, and carrying. The villagers begin preparing for sleep, but here's something that might surprise you. Medieval people didn't always sleep the same way modern people do. Historians studying old diaries and medical texts discovered references to something called first sleep and second sleep. Many people would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for a few hours, wake up briefly around midnight, and then fall asleep again until morning. During that quiet midnight hour, some people prayed, reflected, or even visited neighbors before returning to bed. Historians still argue whether this pattern was universal across medieval Europe or simply common in certain regions, but it does show that the idea of one uninterrupted 8-hour sleep might actually be a more modern habit. For now, though, your body is ready for the first sleep. The candle flickers softly, the fire fades into glowing embers, and the medieval night deepens around you. Tomorrow will bring another sunrise, another long list of chores, and another full day of survival in a world far less comfortable than the one you know. But for now, the village rests. And you do too. Morning doesn't arrive gently in medieval Europe. It arrives suddenly. A rooster somewhere in the village explodes into sound, crowing like it has an urgent announcement for the entire countryside. One rooster starts, then another joins in, and soon it feels like every bird within a mile has decided that the sun must be loudly informed of its own arrival. You groan quietly and shift under your wool blanket. The faint grey light of early dawn is slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Your body aches a little. Sleeping on straw may sound rustic and charming in modern imagination, but the reality is less comfortable. The mattress beneath you has compressed unevenly overnight, and small pieces of straw poke through the rough linen cover. You sit up slowly. Your back pops. Your knees complain. And just like that, another medieval day begins. You pull on the same clothes you wore yesterday. In fact, most people in medieval Europe owned very few outfits. A typical peasant might have one working set of clothes and maybe one slightly nicer set for church or special occasions. Clothing was expensive because fabric itself was expensive. Every thread had to be spun by hand. Every piece of cloth woven slowly on a loom. A mainstream historical fact is that textile production was one of the most labor-intensive industries of the medieval world. Spinning wool into yarn could take hours, and weaving cloth could take days or weeks, which explains why clothing was worn repeatedly and repaired constantly. You step outside the house and stretch. Cold morning air brushes your face. The village is already waking up. A few neighbors are leading animals out of small wooden pens. A woman carries a bucket toward the communal well. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer has already begun tapping against metal. There's no such thing as sleeping late when your entire economy depends on daylight. And daylight, unfortunately, is limited. Medieval people organized their schedules almost entirely around the sun. Artificial lighting existed, candles, oil lamps, but they were expensive and dim, so the rule was simple. Work when the sun is up. Rest when it's gone. You walk toward the well with a wooden bucket. Water is heavy. A full bucket can weigh more than 20 pounds, and carrying it across uneven ground requires steady balance. Most villages had a shared well or spring, and maintaining access to clean water was a constant priority. Historians studying medieval health often point out that water quality could vary dramatically. Wells could become contaminated by waste, animals, or flooding. This sometimes contributed to disease outbreaks. But for everyday villagers, the well was also a social center. People gathered here daily. They talked. They exchanged small bits of news. They complained about weather, crops, taxes, and occasionally the lord of the manor. You lower the bucket carefully into the well and listen to the splash. The rope creaks as you pull it back up. Nearby, two older villagers are already deep in conversation. One of them mentions rumors about soldiers traveling through a nearby town. News spread slowly in medieval Europe. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Information moved mainly through travelers, merchants, wandering monks, or soldiers, and sometimes the stories became slightly exaggerated. A quirky historical tidbit: medieval travelers often brought news that sounded almost mythical to villagers. Reports of distant lands might include strange animals, unusual customs, or unbelievable cities. Some listeners probably accepted these stories with wide-eyed curiosity. Others likely rolled their eyes quietly and thought, "That sounds suspicious." Historians still argue whether medieval villagers were generally more trusting of such stories or more skeptical than we assume. But either way, news traveled slowly. You carry the water bucket back toward your home. As you walk, the smells of morning begin drifting through the village. Smoke from cooking fires, fresh bread, baking in ovens, and occasionally the less pleasant smell of livestock. Animals lived very close to people in medieval communities. Chickens, pigs, goats, and cows were essential parts of daily life. And while they provided food and labor, they also produced, well, everything animals produce. Which means medieval villages had a very strong scent profile. But when you live with something every day, you eventually stop noticing it. You return inside and pour some water into a wooden bowl to wash your face. Soap exists, but it's not used daily by most peasants. Medieval soap was often made from animal fat and ashes, and it wasn't always gentle on skin. Still, basic washing was important. Cleanliness had both practical and cultural value. Medieval medical theory based on those famous four humours believed that maintaining balance inside the body helped prevent illness. Washing, fresh air, and moderate diet were all recommended. Of course, medieval medicine also included some ideas that sound strange today. One treatment for headaches involved placing a warm cabbage leaf on the forehead. Another suggested that certain illnesses could be improved by carefully adjusting the patient's diet based on their humour imbalance. And then there were the occasional more creative remedies. For example, one medieval text recommends rubbing crushed snails on the skin to treat certain conditions. Did it work? Historians still debate how effective many medieval treatments actually were. Some herbal remedies genuinely helped. Others probably relied more on hope than science. You finish washing and step back outside. The sun is now fully rising over the fields. Golden light stretches across farmland, warming the ground slowly after the cold night. Another long work day waits. Fields need tending, animals need feeding, tools need repairing, and the rhythm of medieval life continues steady, demanding, and very rarely glamorous. The idea of medieval knights charging heroically across battlefields might dominate movies and legends, but the reality of everyday life for most people in medieval Europe is something much simpler. Work, food, sleep, repeat. And you're only halfway through the day. By the time the sun climbs higher into the sky, the quiet coolness of morning has already disappeared. The fields are warm now. You stand ankle deep in dirt, gripping a wooden-handled tool that feels heavier with every passing hour. Farming in medieval Europe is not the gentle pastoral scene that paintings sometimes suggest. It is repetitive, exhausting labor that bends your back and fills your hands with blisters. The soil must be turned. Weeds must be pulled. Crops must be watched carefully. If the harvest fails, the consequences are not inconvenient, they are dangerous. A mainstream historical fact is that most medieval Europeans were peasants, working under the feudal system, where land was owned by a lord but farmed by villagers who owed labor or crops in return. In many places, peasants were required to spend several days each week working directly on the lord's fields, before tending their own small plots. So even if your back aches and your shoulders burn, the work continues. You dig, lift, and step forward. Dig, lift, step forward again. Somewhere nearby, another farmer coughs and wipes sweat from his forehead with a rough sleeve. Nobody complains much. Complaining doesn't change the weather. and it definitely doesn't make crops grow faster. In medieval agriculture, timing was everything. Plant too early and frost could destroy everything. Plant too late and the crops wouldn't mature before autumn cold returned. Historians still argue whether medieval farmers relied more on inherited tradition or careful seasonal observation when deciding planting schedules. In reality, it was probably a mix of both. Generations of experience created an unspoken calendar that everyone understood, and mistakes were expensive. You pause for a moment and stretch your back. The field spreads around you in quiet rows dotted with workers moving slowly across the land. This kind of farming depends entirely on human and animal muscle. Plows are usually pulled by oxen, and tools are simple wood, iron, rope. Nothing here runs on engines. Nothing moves quickly. But slowly, steadily, the work gets done. A quirky historical tidbit is that medieval farmers sometimes believed certain counting days were luckier than others. Some followed old folk traditions tied to phases of the moon, believing crops planted during specific lunar cycles would grow stronger. Whether this actually helped crops grow better is debatable. Historians still argue whether these traditions had any practical agricultural benefit or simply provided psychological comfort for farmers facing unpredictable weather. But when your entire livelihood depends on forces you can't control, a little superstition can feel reassuring. You lean on your tool for a moment and glance toward the village. A small bell rings in the distance. That sound usually means one thing: midday. And midday means food. Lunch is simple. You sit with a few other workers in the shade of a tree, pulling out small bundles wrapped in cloth. Your meal probably includes dark bread, dense, coarse, and slightly sour. Medieval bread for peasants was often made from rye or barley rather than fine wheat. It was heavier, darker, and much tougher than the fluffy bread most people eat today. You break off a piece and chew slowly. There might be a little cheese, maybe an onion. If you're lucky, a slice of salted meat. Preserving food without refrigeration was one of the constant challenges of medieval life. Salting, smoking, and drying were the most common methods, and they often made food extremely salty. But salty food lasts longer, and survival matters more than flavor. Nearby, someone shares a small jug of weak ale. Yes, ale. In medieval Europe, ale was commonly consumed throughout the day, even by workers. The alcohol content was usually low, and brewing the drink often made water safer to consume because the boiling process killed many harmful microorganisms, so drinking ale was sometimes actually healthier than drinking untreated water. You take a small sip, warm, slightly bitter, but refreshing enough after hours of work. For a moment, everyone rests quietly. No one rushes lunch. Energy is precious, and even a short break helps restore strength before the afternoon begins. A breeze moves across the field, carrying the soft rustling sound of crops shifting gently in the wind. And for a brief moment, medieval life feels peaceful. But peace in the Middle Ages is often temporary, because life here depends on fragile systems. A sudden storm could flatten crops. A disease could wipe out livestock, or worse, conflict could arrive unexpectedly. Medieval Europe saw frequent small wars, raids, and disputes between neighboring lords. Villages sometimes found themselves caught in the middle of conflicts they had nothing to do with. Historians still argue how often ordinary villagers actually experienced violence directly, but records suggest that many communities lived with at least the possibility of danger, which meant that survival often required cooperation. Villagers helped each other during harvests. They shared tools. They helped repair homes damaged by storms. Community wasn't just friendly, it was necessary, because nobody survived alone. You finish the last bite of bread and stand again, brushing dust from your clothes. The break is over. The sun still hangs high in the sky, and there are many more rows to finish before evening arrives. You pick up the tool again. Dig. Lift. Step forward. Dig again. The rhythm continues. It's not heroic. It's not glorious. But it's the quiet, persistent heartbeat of medieval life. And as the afternoon stretches ahead, you realize something. The legends of knights and castles might dominate history books, but the real medieval world is built by people exactly like you, quietly working in the dirt beneath the sun. The evening air cools slowly as darkness settles across the village. The sky turns from pale gold to soft purple, and the first faint stars begin appearing above the rooftops. After a full day of work, the world suddenly feels quieter. You step inside the small wooden cottage and close the door behind you. The interior is dim, lit mostly by the glow of a small fire burning in a stone hearth. The smell of smoke hangs gently in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of damp wood and straw. This is home, not luxurious by any modern standard, but shelter was one of the most valuable things a medieval family could have. A well-known historical fact is that most peasants in medieval Europe lived in simple one-room houses called wattle and daub cottages. The walls were made from woven wooden strips coated with mud, clay and straw. The roofs were usually thatched with dried grass or reeds. Surprisingly, these houses worked fairly well for insulation, but they had problems too. Smoke from indoor fires often filled the room because early cottages rarely had chimneys. Instead, the smoke escaped slowly through small holes in the roof. This meant the air inside was constantly hazy. Your eyes would probably sting a little if you lived here long enough. Still, the fire is comforting. You move closer to it, stretching your tired hands toward the warmth. The heat relaxes muscles that spent the entire day gripping farming tools. Dinner preparations are already underway. Meals in medieval villages were simple and repetitive, but they were essential for restoring energy after long days of labor. A common evening meal might include thick vegetable stew, coarse bread, onions, cabbage, and sometimes bits of salted meat if the family was fortunate. Bread, in particular, formed the backbone of medieval diets. Historians estimate that peasants sometimes consumed over 2 pounds of bread per day. It provided calories, strength, and a sense of fullness that helped people endure demanding physical work. You take a seat on a rough wooden bench near the table. The bench creaks slightly under your weight. A pot bubbles quietly over the fire. The smell of cooking vegetables slowly fills the room, warm and earthy. It may not be fancy, but after a long day in the fields, it smells incredible. A quirky historical tidbit: medieval cooks sometimes used bread not only as food, but also as plates. Thick slices of stale bread called trenchers were placed under food to absorb juices and sauces. After the meal, the soaked bread could be eaten or sometimes given to animals or the poor, simple solutions for practical problems. As the stew finishes cooking, you hear quiet sounds from outside the cottage. Chickens rustle in their coop. Somewhere nearby, a cow lets out a low, sleepy moo. Animals were a constant part of medieval village life. Many families kept livestock close to the house, both for protection and convenience. In colder regions, animals were sometimes brought inside during winter nights to share warmth. Historians still argue whether this practice significantly improved survival during harsh winters, or if it simply made living conditions more crowded and unsanitary. Probably a bit of both. Dinner is finally ready. You scoop a portion of stew into a wooden bowl. The broth is thick, filled with cabbage, beans, and small pieces of root vegetables. The first bite is warm and satisfying. After hours of physical labor, the body appreciates even the simplest food. Conversations during medieval meals were usually quiet. People saved their energy throughout the day, and evenings often became moments of calm reflection rather than loud social gatherings. Though occasionally, stories would be shared. Villagers loved telling stories about wandering travelers, mysterious creatures in nearby forests, or legends about kings and heroes from distant lands. One popular medieval belief involved fair folk, or magical creatures, believed to live in forests and hills. People sometimes left small offerings of food outside their homes to avoid angering these invisible neighbors. Historians still argue whether villagers genuinely believed in such beings, or simply used the stories as cultural traditions passed down through generations. But when nights were dark and forests stretched endlessly beyond the village, a little superstition probably felt comforting. You finish the last of the stew slowly. The warmth spreads through your body, easing the ache in your arms and back. Outside, the night has fully arrived now. Without modern electric lights, medieval nights were incredibly dark. The only illumination came from fires, candles, or the moon overhead. This darkness shaped daily life more than we often realize. People went to sleep earlier because there was little reason to stay awake after sunset. However, historians have discovered something fascinating about medieval sleep patterns. Many people followed what scholars call segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping straight through the night, they often slept in 2 separate blocks. The first sleep lasted a few hours, followed by a short waking period in the middle of the night. During this quiet time, people might pray, talk softly, or simply sit by the fire. Then they returned to sleep for a second stretch until dawn. Historians still debate whether this pattern was common everywhere or mostly observed in certain regions, but the idea makes sense in a world governed by natural light rather than clocks. You set the empty bowl aside and lean back slightly. The fire crackles softly. Outside, a breeze moves gently through the village, rustling the thatched roofs and trees. The sounds of the day tools striking soil, animals moving through fields, voices calling across farmland have faded away. Now, only small nighttime noises remain. A dog barking far away, an owl hooting softly somewhere near the forest, and the slow, steady rhythm of a quiet village preparing for rest. Your eyelids begin to feel heavy. Not surprising. After surviving an entire day in medieval Europe, your body is ready for sleep. Real, deep sleep. Because tomorrow, the cycle will begin again. The fire burns lower now, its orange glow soft and steady, casting slow shadows across the rough wooden walls of the cottage. Outside, the medieval village has grown almost completely silent. You lie down on a simple bed, if it can really be called that. A typical medieval sleeping arrangement wasn't the soft mattress you might imagine today. Most peasants slept on wooden frames or simple platforms stuffed with straw, dried grass or wool. These mattresses were called palliasses, and while they worked well enough, they weren't exactly luxurious. You shift slightly, trying to find a comfortable position. The straw inside the mattress rustles quietly beneath you. A well-known historical fact is that medieval beds were often shared. Entire families sometimes slept in the same bed, or at least in the same room. Houses were small, heat was limited, and sharing body warmth made nights far more tolerable during cold seasons. Privacy, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. But in a world where survival depended on cooperation, closeness felt natural. The last embers of the fire flicker gently. Your eyes slowly adjust to the darkness. Nighttime in medieval Europe felt dramatically different from modern nights. Without electric lights, the darkness was deeper thick, almost physical. When the moon hid behind clouds, entire villages could disappear into near total blackness. It's quiet enough that you begin noticing tiny sounds. The faint creaking of wood as the house settles, a soft breeze slipping through tiny cracks in the walls. Somewhere outside, the distant hoot of an owl echoing across the fields. Nature never truly sleeps. You pull a rough wool blanket closer around your shoulders. Wool was one of the most important materials in medieval Europe. In fact, historians note that the wool trade became one of the most valuable economic industries of the Middle Ages, especially in places like England and parts of France. Sheep weren't just animals. They were walking sources of clothing, warmth, and economic survival. A quirky historical detail, medieval people often believed certain animals carried supernatural meaning. Owls, for example, were sometimes seen as mysterious creatures connected to omens or spirits. Historians still argue whether villagers truly feared such signs or simply repeated old folklore passed down through generations. But lying in the dark countryside, hearing that distant owl call, it's easy to understand why people once believed the night held secrets. Your body begins to relax. Muscles that worked hard all day slowly loosen, and your breathing grows slower and deeper. Sleep approaches. But medieval nights weren't always peaceful. Many villagers had a watchman, someone responsible for walking through the streets at night, keeping an eye out for fires, thieves, or wandering animals. Fires were especially dangerous, because most buildings were made of wood and straw. A single uncontrolled flame could destroy an entire village. The watchman's job was to stay alert while everyone else slept. Some even carried lanterns or rattles to warn people if danger appeared. You imagine hearing faint footsteps outside, the slow pace of someone making their rounds through the quiet streets. Another reminder that life here is fragile, yet despite these risks, the night feels calm. Your mind drifts slightly. You remember the long day, the fields, the tools, the labor under the sun. Medieval work was relentless, but the rhythm of life had its own steady balance. Day meant labor. Night meant rest. No glowing screens, no buzzing phones, just darkness, firelight, and the slow turning of the stars overhead. Historians sometimes debate whether medieval people actually slept better than modern humans. Without artificial light disrupting natural rhythms, Their bodies may have followed healthier sleep cycles, but of course, their lives were also full of stress disease, famine, harsh winters, and constant physical work. So the truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. You shift slightly on the straw mattress. It's not perfect, but exhaustion, Mac,